in this regard. So I'll quickly introduce myself now, and then I'll go on to the rest of the guests. So my name is Kweku. I'm the program manager at YSYS. I lead on all of the founder-related support that we offer. Recently launched our most recent Founders Door Pre-Accelerator program, which supports young, diverse talent from the kind of proof of concept stage of the business. So coming in with an idea and how they can go through the various stages to validate the business ideas before launching. So we are on our 4th cohort, and it's been a very successful program so far, and hoping to expand that support that we offer over time as well. So before we kick off, I'll just give you a very brief overview of the schedule. So we're going to have about 20-25 minutes or so of discussion with the panel. Throughout the whole time, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section on the platform. So you can just kind of type in your questions, and when we do the Q&A session, we can essentially go through those questions. So do feel free to ask those as you go. Hopefully I've given quite a holistic kind of array of questions to ask in advance, but of course we want it to be as practical to you and your particular concerns as possible, so do feel free to post through those questions. Great, okay, so with all of that done, I think let's just kick off. So I'll go one by one if you can introduce yourself. So starting with Andy Lewis, if you can just introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Andy. I'm a partner in Travers Smith. I specialise in pensions law and advising corporate pension funds on a whole range of issues. So that could be investment, could be M&A activity involving a pension fund, but yeah, a big part of my job day to day is negotiation, and that's why I'm here.
Perfect, thank you, Andy, welcome. Alex.
Hi everyone, yeah, I'm Alex and I'm an associate solicitor in the pensions team at Travers. So I actually work very closely with Andy on a day-to-day basis. So everything he's just said, I do as well, just not as well.
Thank you, Alex. And Siv, if you want to introduce yourself, please.
Hi everybody, I'm Siv. I am Senior Associate in the tax team at Travers Smith. I focus on transactional tax, meaning a lot of M&A activity, kind of corporate advice. So a large part of what I do involves negotiating the tax provisions of commercial deals. Background-wise, I've been at Travers for 2 years now. I was at a Magic Circle firm before.
Perfect, thank you, Siv. Cool, so I thought just to kick off this conversation, just to keep it very broad and to make it really clear what we mean by negotiation, because, you know, it's a term that's used a lot. It means something different to different people. So when we think about effective negotiation in particular, how would you describe that? What are the characteristics of an effective negotiator? And I'll just leave that open for anyone on the panel to give their view on.
For me, I would say an effective negotiation is where you've got what you most wanted to get, but also importantly, the other person walked away feeling like ideally they got a good deal, or failing that they've at least not been taken advantage of.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think this will vary depending on the particular context of the negotiation, but I think it's important to remember that you will have your own objectives when you go into a negotiation, and it's important to be clear on what they are when you go into it. But I think one of the important skills in negotiation is to, as best you can, try to preempt what your counterpart wants to get out of the negotiation as well. And if you spend a bit of time thinking about what their objectives are and what their non-negotiable outcomes might be, I think that will probably put you in a much stronger position and help you find some common ground. And that, I think that links with what Siv was just saying about, in terms of the outcome, you wanting to walk away with what you perceive to be a good deal, but the other person ideally also walking away with what they consider to be a good deal, or at least not being taken advantage of.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. For me, an effective negotiation is a process, and it's really important to remember that. So it's all about clarity, in the sense of being clear about what you want and what you want to achieve and what your red lines are, and how you explain those to your counterparty, but then also really listening to what the other counterparty is trying to say. So not just hearing it, but taking that into account. And then hopefully what you end up with is a result that everyone is happy, or at least comfortable with, or you reach a point where you both know that actually this isn't going to go any further, and at least then you're clear that you can walk away and what that means.
Right, perfect. Thank you all for those perspectives. I feel like there's so many little gems that were dropped between those that are going to kind of pick up on through some of the subsequent questions. But I think let's just kind of bring it to life and think about a scenario that a lot of the listeners here will, you know, kind of relate to and be thinking about. So, you know, you come in as an employee to a new company, for instance. You may be relatively junior. You may have been in your role for maybe 2 to 4 years. And you feel like you want to, you know, you're starting to question whether or not you are in a position to now get a pay increase or promotion. Maybe you've done a really big project that you've been, that went really successfully and you're very proud of, and you think that should be compensated by a pay increase. So sometimes this is a daunting conversation to have because of, for instance, the kind of different dynamic in kind of like between someone that's your boss and then you being someone that's junior and not knowing how to go about actually broaching that conversation. So how do you actually, from just an initial standpoint, bring up or bring to attention of your employer that you want a promotion or an increase in pay? What are the kind of practical steps you take initially?
Shall I start with that one? I have to be careful what I say here because Alex is probably going to use this against me. I would say don't be shy about doing it, and don't wait for you know, an annual appraisal or an annual review or something like that. If you think you deserve a pay rise and you've built a case for doing that, then get a line manager on side, take them for a coffee, take them for an informal chat, and start the conversation. You might not get the result immediately. I would expect the manager to want to take it away and think about it and negotiate, for example, with the HR team. And I think it's all about doing your prep and making a case for a pay rise. So I would say that quite often, and we've all been here, you go into discussions feeling like, I've done loads and loads of really great work in the past and I want to be rewarded for that. And that's true. But going back to what Alex said right at the beginning, it's about understanding the perspective of the other party to the negotiation. And I think a business is much more likely to see a pay rise as an investment. So it's all about showing them why they should make that investment, you know, your commitment to the organization, the extra value that you will bring going forward in return for that pay rise. I think that is a much more positive way of framing your argument.
Yeah, I agree with that, and just to jump in and build on that, I think it's definitely relevant if you have done some good work previously, and I think to build on what Andy was saying, sometimes it's important to try and strike while the iron's hot. If you do a really important project in, you know, October, pick a month, but your annual review isn't until the following June, then there's a good chance that in that intervening period, then the goodwill that you'll have generated from doing a good job will have been forgotten to some extent. So sometimes it is better to just get to the end of a busy period, or a period where you've been working on something and you feel that you've done a really good job. That might be the most appropriate time. But I agree that it's as much about looking forward as it is about looking back. And I think this is where, going back to some of the points made to the previous question, this is about where you can try and look at how your interests can be aligned. You can talk about your own personal growth and your own development, and the revenue that you can generate for the business, or the projects that you can do in the future for the business, And you can try your best to align those to what your manager's interests will be, with the idea that you can paint a picture where you both grow together. So it's not as confrontational as I've done a good job, I want more money, and them saying, well, I don't want to pay you more money because that affects my profit margins. If you can present a case where you say, look, I want to stay with you, I want to grow with you, and these are some of the things that I think I can do in the future. If you can actually show that you will help to generate more revenue for the business, then that, as Andy said, will be more, that'll be easier for the business and your manager to frame as an investment in you, rather than you just trying to get money out of the business.
A couple of things I'd probably add. I agree with all of that. Firstly, on timing, and very much picking up on what Andy was saying, it may well be that it absolutely makes sense to strike when the iron is hot and talk to your line manager, say in October, but have a think about whether your industry or your firm generally has particular times when they make promotions, because maybe the time to have that chat was October. You've just finished a great project, you did really well, you've got a whole bunch of examples to take to kind of show your value, but your promotion might be, say, 6 months away. And building on what Andy and Alex was saying, you can think of that as, we've got 6 months to go. So yeah, in all likelihood, they're not going to say immediately, yes, absolutely, you can have your promotion. But what they will do is start that conversation with you. And you can use that to ask for, what am I not showing you yet that I need to show? And start that dialogue. I mean, they'll only appreciate that because you're showing interest and passion in the fact that you're dedicated to staying in the business. And I think it can make the conversation feel a little bit more organic and less, using other words, confrontational, more like you're on the same side of the team. Probably everything I had to add.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the key thing that I'm getting from all three of you is the sense that there is an element of prep that needs to be done, and an element of preempting what your, however it be your employer or potential partner will be wanting to gain as well. So with that in mind, I was thinking, what are the kind of like key things that you need to be prepping prior to an initial meeting? So maybe you might have put in time in the calendar for that coffee, or to you've done like an email to broach the topic of having a meeting, for instance. Like, what do you need to be prepping in between those times before you actually go for that coffee or have that meeting?
Shall I start? I think a couple of things. Firstly, and we've touched on some of this already, think about, if you're asking for, say, a promotion, do your research on what that job would be. It might actually be that they're looking for a slightly different skill set, or it's the same sort of job but harder, and you need to show that you're performing at that level. Do your research, come up with what the criteria are, maybe talk to some friendly senior people, and then it's probably good practice to, as you're going along, keep a sort of written track record of how you're doing well, examples of where you went above and beyond, or examples of particularly unique skills that that you're bringing to the team. Because often you'll find when you get to the conversation, at least this happens to me, you go blank. And I think prepping beforehand, doing your homework, in other words, being as over prepared as you can really help, because it will also make you feel more relaxed and like you're right to be asking for what you're asking for. And if you've got that supporting evidence, you're also perfectly reasonable in doing it as well. So do your homework, would be my part.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about how to broach these conversations in practice, because I'm the same. When I have my annual reviews and the partners say to me, how do you think you've done this year? If I haven't prepared, will go blank, and my response will be, all right. And that doesn't really reflect, hopefully doesn't reflect what I've done over the previous year. And I suppose there are different things that you can bring to the conversation depending on the particular context of the role. And I suppose some are more tangible than others. If you work in a role, for example, where your role is to generate revenue, if you're in charge of, it might be a sales role, or it could be bringing new clients in. your role might be assessed by how much revenue you generate. And where it's something like that, if you can demonstrate that over the period of time, or over the last year, or over the period of time that you've worked at a business, you can show steady growth in revenue. You can quite easily demonstrate your value there by showing a graph, and the graph points up, and therefore you've done well. Where your role isn't as focused on the numbers, it can be a little bit more difficult. But that's not to say that the skills that you bring don't generate value in perhaps in a less tangible way. It might be that you're 1 or 2 steps removed from the ultimate value generation, but that just means that you need to give a little bit more thought about how what you do feeds into the profitability of the business. And going back to what we were saying earlier, if anything where you can put together a business case for you generating more money and more profit for the business that you're in, that's probably going to be the most compelling evidence for your manager to give you a pay rise. But that's obviously not to say that the other things you do around the sides aren't helpful. But putting yourself in your manager's shoes, you would want, I suspect, to be confident that you're going to get something out in exchange for that pay rise.
Yeah, I think I'd completely echo what Alex and Siv have just said. I really like that idea of keeping track of good work that you've done or praise that you've received, and maybe having a little email folder or something where you do actually put that on one side as soon as it happens, because I think actually people generally set really high standards for themselves, and they're actually quite hard on themselves. So quite apart from having that all that information at your fingertips when you're ready to start negotiating for a promotion or a pay rise, it's actually just quite good for your mental health generally, I think, to look back and go, oh, I'm actually doing an okay job here. The other thing I would say, just to add to what Alex and Siv have said, is as well as thinking about you and what you have achieved, put yourself in the manager's shoes. So try and anticipate things that they might ask you, or things that they think they will be looking for. And it might be there's a career progression framework or a set of competencies that the business has quite clearly set out, and you can look through those for the role you're seeking and look for ideas and evidence that you're already demonstrating that. So prep about yourself, but also try and do a bit of thinking ahead about what management might say and the questions they might ask you.
Perfect. All really, really useful tips. I think there are certain scenarios, and particularly in certain industries, where it is not that clear what, for instance, your colleagues or counterparts that are doing similar roles in different organizations, or people that are doing similar roles but maybe have different titles, etc., how much they earn, for instance. And that can kind of put you at a disadvantage, I guess, when you come to a negotiation, because you're not really fully sure what the value of the work that you've been doing is worth to the wider industry, or even to other people within your firm. So when there's that asymmetry of information, how do you kind of navigate that negotiation process?
Well, I suppose the sort of slightly obvious answer to that question is to try and plug the information gap before you start. So you could do things like look for job adverts in the wider industry for similar roles. You could even go and talk to recruiters or agents. Maybe take what they say with a pinch of salt about promising you to get a better salary if only you move, but it can still help you inform your conversation.
I think I'd also just echo a lot of what we've already said, in that it may just be that it really is hard to find out. And I completely get that, particularly on the more junior end of your career. It's also very awkward. You're not really going to always be able to go up to someone and go, so how much do you earn? I completely get that. But that doesn't necessarily always have to matter. Kind of back yourself, find the value of what you've been doing, and everything that Andy and Alex have been saying about look at how the business is doing, look at how the team is doing. what gaps can you identify that you know that you've been filling or know that you could fill. Yes, ideally we'd have perfect information, but even if you don't have that, that doesn't mean that you don't have anything that you can use.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I agree with everything that's been said. I suppose it depends on the nature of the business that you're in. Some larger businesses might have policies and kind of job descriptions for different roles. So you might be at a particular level of the hierarchy, you might be looking at the level above. So the skills that your employer is looking for might be listed. It might be in the public domain, it might be on a sort of intranet site or something. And there might be a range of salaries. You know, again, doing your research is important. There are websites, I think Glassdoor's one that publishes some information about salary. Again, take that with a pinch of salt, but you might get an idea about the range that you'd be looking at. But I think ultimately it's a case of what you perceive your worth to be. And you know, there might be people elsewhere doing a similar role in a different business that might be earning more than you. They might not as well. You might never know. The question is whether you're happy with what you're earning and whether you think that your salary and the package that you're on reflects the value that you bring to the business. And you know, money's important, but there are other considerations in your job satisfaction. And if you're happy doing your job and you're happy with what you're getting paid, that to me feels like a good deal. You might move elsewhere and get paid a little bit more, but you might not like the culture, you might not like the environment, you might not like the role. So just be careful about the kind of grass is always greener on the other side attitude, because in some cases it isn't.
Definitely, yeah. I think it's really important to note that last point in particular, like that there is a lot more to consider than just the actual financial aspect of your compensation. It's kind of work-life balance, there's the flexibility aspect, there's so many other things that you might want to consider as well. So these are definitely things to also consider when you get into negotiation process. Great. And then I guess, you know, you have and the stuff that you've already all alluded to as far as like the preparation you make, the types of kind of thinking about the questions that you would want to answer before you actually go in. So that you can kind of preempt what your employer or potential partner will be looking for. But when the actual process starts itself, is often recommended that, you know, as you said, it's not a one-way thing. It's very much like a conversation as well, the way you navigate that type of discussion. So what are the types of questions that you should be asking the other party during that process? Because you want to, like you said, get as much information as possible so that you can know how to strategically position yourself. What are the types of information you want to work out during the process itself as opposed to just before, if that makes sense?
I'd say, I mean, there's a few things you could say. If it's about a promotion, and say it's one of your initial conversations and the impression that you're getting is it's a maybe but not necessarily sure, I would tactfully try really hard to understand what's bothering them, what concerns do they have, what barriers are there, and you can do that in a perfectly nice way, but kind of do what you can to understand where they're coming from and what their issues are. Some of the barriers might just be things like they don't think you're confident enough, and you can then talk to them about how to address that. Or it could be something more objective, like the way that the business is going, there isn't the money right now to give you a pay rise, but there would be next year if you can show X, Y, Z. And I guess I'm just saying in different ways. It's all about, I think, asking whatever questions you need to make sure that you've understood their position, because only by doing that can you address them. And the other thing I was going to say was, say that they do agree. It can be really helpful if you can get them to agree with you what are the next steps. So it could be that, for instance, they're saying, I'm not sure yet, we need to talk about it. And then now isn't the time to push them. Instead, I'd suggest now's the time to go, okay, I completely understand that. Let's put a marker down and kind of for next time,
Mm.
and set more of a sort of a timeline and an ongoing dialogue. I think that's quite important as well with questions that you're asking.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of really good points there, and just to build on them, I think it's important to know that rarely in life are you going to get a pay rise without having to do anything in exchange for it. There are times where, yeah, you've performed very well and your employer wants to reflect that and give you a little bit of extra money. But if you're wanting to earn significantly more money than you're on at the moment, that essentially involves a change in role. And improving the quality and standard of the work that you do is important, and that's something that will come with hard work and experience. But other things to think about are what more you can do for the business. So it might involve taking on more responsibility, and this links to what Sid was saying about trying to find out what your manager's concerns are if you're getting the impression that it isn't a definite yes. And to kind of build on that, it might be some personal development points. So Siv used the kind of confidence example, and there are lots of other examples that you could look at. So you might need to think about, well, okay, well, how can I address that? But you might also have some ideas that can help grow the business. And so, well, I think maybe we could expand into this area, and I'd be prepared to take responsibility for X, Y, and Z. So it's a combination of saying, look, I think I've done really good work in the past, I'll continue to do really good work in the future, and my salary should reflect that. But also thinking about what new areas you might be able to move into, and that can in turn help you move up an organisation, can help the organisation grow itself and generate more revenue, and then that just goes back to making the business case for you being paid more.
Whoops, sorry, bit of a technical problem with my mic there. I was just going to, agree with Alex and Sid. I think implicit in what they've been saying there is a really important point, which is when you're, as Kwaku said, this is a conversation, it's a dialogue. That's what negotiation is about. So think about using open questions. How can we resolve this? What are you looking for here? What's your objective? I would say I tend not to use why in a negotiation. Why? Because that can seem a bit accusatory. Those are much more neutral territory. I suppose just stepping back from the sort of pay rise promotion negotiations and looking back at it a bit more widely, there might be situations where you're in a negotiation and the conversation is just going round in circles, and both parties end up in a situation where they're just restating their existing positions. And I think you might find that, for example, if you are an individual customer and you're negotiating with a bank or another large financial institution, and you can see there's a real asymmetry of bargaining power there. Now that might be real, or it might just be the other side thinking that they have more bargaining power than you. But sometimes that can be quite frustrating when you're in the heat of the moment, and very important not to let that employ. If I find myself in that situation, is to ask, okay, I hear what you're saying. Our joint objective here is to try and reach a solution. How do you see that working? How are we going to progress this? Bearing in mind what you've just told me about your position.
Sorry, I was on mute there. So I often, like, whether it be in movies or, there's certain scenarios where you see someone come in and you have the typical exchange where you come with, okay, cool, I actually want $200,000, but let me ask for $1 million, and then you kind of work my way down and meet somewhere halfway. Is that a strategy that you actually recommend? Like, should you go in like really high and then knowing that you can kind of get negotiate it down a bit, or do you just go in like, okay, cool, this is what I want, this is the number I want, let me stick to it? Like, what are your various opinions on how to navigate that?
I think that's a good question. I think a lot of it will depend on your personal circumstances and how confident you feel in having that interaction, and also your relationship with the person that you're speaking to. It would be a lot easier, I think, if you have a good rapport and a really strong relationship with the person that you're talking to just say, look, this is what I'd like, and actually be honest in saying what you like. And I think you're more likely to try to be able to find a way to work that out if you have a good relationship. On the other end of the spectrum, I think there's some value in going in a bit high, knowing that in most cases that the person you're negotiating with will try and knock a bit off. And that goes back to the point we were making right at the beginning about both parties walking away feeling like they've achieved something. And if you go in and say, I want £1 million a year, and the other person says, okay, they probably won't feel like they've got anything out of it. But if they can chip you down a bit, then they might feel like, oh, I've got a good deal here as well. But it is important to not go in too high. If you go in too high and your requests are just totally unrealistic, that can kill the negotiation immediately, and it impacts your credibility. So if you are going to take that approach of going in high, make sure it is still within a reasonable band. And we talked a lot about research. If you go in and you ask for something that is totally unreasonable and totally outside the range of what is paid in the market for that role, again, it can impact someone's perception of you, and it can make them think that you haven't done your research. So I think that's a very long-winded way of saying it's probably just a case of what you're most comfortable with. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule on that. But perhaps try to establish a band or a range of, let's say we talk about salaries again, you might say, well, I think it's realistic to get X, but that's very much towards the top end of the spectrum, but you can maybe go in with that, and then you can maybe have a lower end as well. And then anything that you come out with in the middle is still a success.
I think I just reiterate everything Alex said, with particular stress on, I really, really wouldn't go in with an outrageous proposal. No good will come of that. And as you said, I think all you'll do is, particularly the most likely scenario is if you're asking for a pay rise, you're talking to an employer who you hopefully have a good relationship with. You don't want to damage that by seeming ridiculously demanding. And there's a couple of Q&A questions where I think a couple of people have asked about what's too much, what's a significant increase in salary. I think really unhelpfully my answer to that is going to be, it sort of depends on your circumstances and your business and what the pay bands are between different people in the hierarchy that you're in, or if you don't have a hierarchy, it probably is more dependent on the business. I mean, Andy, Alex, I don't know if you've got anything more helpful than that to say on that.
I think it's partly a question of how much are you doing already, and how much extra are you prepared to do to justify the pay rise. Remember that pay is something you are given in exchange for work. So, you have to think about it that way and think, well, how much is my work, how much is my labour worth, and how much more am I willing to give? I think that's really, really good advice from Siv and Alex, and I don't have a lot to add. I think that question about, yes, absolutely, don't go in too high, but whether you go in a little bit higher and then let yourself get beaten back is very much a question of judgment and thinking about your relationship and how much you trust the person that you're negotiating with. And if you trust them enough, then it is perfectly okay to go, look, I'm going to level with you. This is what I want. But if you don't know, or you don't trust them so much, then perhaps you might err on the side of caution. And that might change as you go through the negotiation.
Definitely. I feel like, we're getting quite a lot of questions coming in from the attendees. So just in the interest of time, I think it's best if we move on to those now. But just before, I had one last question, and I think it will be relevant to everyone listening as well. But, imagine you've gone through the process of negotiating a high salary. or even, a business partnership, for instance, and you realize that you're not kind of getting towards an agreeable conclusion, how do you then essentially know when to walk away from the table, but then also do so in a way where you can still maintain a good relationship with the person after?
What I would say, and this applies to any negotiation, always have a plan B in your back pocket. Understand what the situation will look like if you don't get what you're looking for. And there could be a range of options there. So if you get flat out turned down from a pay rise, do you leave? Do you have you lined up another job? And what would that look like if you had to leave? Alternatively, maybe the business isn't willing to offer you as much as you would like. So will you accept that? Or might you ask for something else instead of a pay rise? Might you want to negotiate a flexible working arrangement or a change in your working pattern or something like that that improves your quality of life and lets you carry on working? And as I think Siv said a few minutes ago, it is possible to have a reasonable and calm as you thought about where the business is coming from, where managers are coming from, and the sorts of things they're looking for. But always have a plan B, because then you'll know that you can walk away if you need to.
Just on when to walk away, I think Andy mentioned this earlier. A good sign is when you realise you're talking in circles. You're sort of repeating points that you've already made, and the other person is as well. And it's probably a good time to cut your losses. And you can do that really politely, where you can say something like, I think I understand all of your points, and I feel like you do too. Maybe it would be best if we both take some time and come back and talk about this another day or next week or something. Put a marker down. But you can do that politely, and there's no shame in doing it. And I'd feel ready to if that's where it's going, because all you're going to do is harm the relationship if you keep pushing.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And remember that walking away from a particular conversation doesn't have to mean walking away from the negotiation completely. As Siv's just said, you can say, okay, I've heard what you said, we're not making any progress here. Why don't we just park that and either carry on negotiating about something else, or just pause the conversation and come back to it when people have calmed down a bit and let off steam?
Yeah, completely agree with that. It doesn't. You can walk away without completely severing the relationship. Sometimes actually having an unsuccessful negotiation can still strengthen a relationship, because even if you haven't managed to reach an agreement on your salary, for example, by virtue of making all the points that you want to make and listening to the points that the other person's making, you probably do have a better understanding of each other's positions, and that might help with the relationship. And as Andy and Siv have both said, walking away from a conversation doesn't mean you're walking away from the negotiation. You can always pick it up again in a few weeks' time, particularly if the other person has said there are just a few things that are perhaps missing. You might want to go away and think about those, potentially work on them, and then bring it back to the table. And again, to build on what Andy was saying about having a plan B, I think that's important. I think just the general advice is to always try to be aware of what else is out there. That doesn't necessarily mean interviewing for different jobs every 5 minutes, because that isn't going to help your relationship, but just having an awareness of what options might be out there if you do end up going down a dead end. And that isn't just in relation to salary, that might be in relation to promotion and growth. You might be in a business where you can't see your long-term future there. So it's helpful to know what else is out there, but always be very careful about bluffing and saying, well, if I don't get this, then I'm going to walk away. That can very easily backfire. So only go nuclear if you really are prepared to walk away, because if you say that and then you end up staying, then that can really impact your credibility.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, guys. So yeah, we have a load of questions to kind of try and zoom through. So if you can answer as briefly, as succinctly as possible, no pressure. And I'll just kind of pick the questions where I feel like they haven't been kind of touched on as of yet. So I had a question from Lauren. Hey, Lauren. So her question was, there's evidence that women are promoted based on performance whilst men are promoted based on potential. How would you suggest someone showcase their potential? That's open to anyone that can tap into that question.
I'd probably say, and I'm sure this will depend industry to industry, that some of it is still historical, but bear with me. I think it will be, hopefully you might have a history with this employer where previously they gave you a chance to rise and you rose. And if you've got any examples or any evidence that you can give where you can show that you're not just doing this current job, you've actually got loads of extra ideas or energy or willingness or just ability to do more. I think any employer would normally see that and kind of see that you're not being challenged enough and that there's probably more that you could do. I think that might be how you show potential. And partly jumping onto another question that's on a similar point, I do personally anyway think that when you're thinking about promotions and pay rises, I don't think it will ever just be about how you've done. I think it should always be about, at least if it's any kind of good business, it should be about, yeah, absolutely, you've been doing a great job, but also you're going to keep doing a great job, and here's how you're going to help the business do even better, which I think does tie into the performance versus potential point as well.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And if it is a role that you've been in or a business that you've been in for a while, going back to Sid's point earlier about keeping a log of things that you've done well, over a period of time, you can show growth, and you can show a particular, you can show an upward trajectory and say, this is where I was when I came into the business. 6 months later, I developed these skills and I was performing better with regard to X, Y, and Z. And then another 6 months later, so you can kind of show that the graph is going up like that in terms of your performance. And I think you just extrapolate that forward, and that is a good way of showing potential.
Great. And I had another question that came through around, I guess, within the current circumstances that we're under with coronavirus. All the advice that you've given so far today, is it something that you'd say is still applicable under these circumstances in which, companies are struggling to kind of conserve their costs? Or is this something that these types of tips you've given, something that are more applicable to be used maybe next year when things have gone back to normality, I guess?
Well, I guess, yeah, you have to take account, as we said earlier, of the circumstances that the business that you're working in is in. I mean, it is just a fact that times are tough right now and businesses are trying to survive, and that means conserving cash. So I think you might have to be prepared to wait a little longer for that pay rise, for that promotion, than we would have done if this horrendous situation hadn't arisen. But going back to something Siv said earlier, that's not a reason to sit quietly. You can still start those conversations and still put a marker down that this is something that you're looking for. And as I said earlier, if a pay rise isn't feasible because the business can't just afford it, maybe there's something else you can agree with the business that will improve your quality of life and make you more satisfied in your job.
Another question came in, so kind of looking at the distinction between the position coming in as a kind of a self-employed person or as an entrepreneur as opposed to an employee, does that change the way in which you should negotiate, or do the same kind of rules apply, would you say?
I think broadly the same rules apply in terms of the basic skills and just the basic position of trying to understand each other. And I'm probably making a number of assumptions here that may or may not be correct, but if you're going in on a self-employed basis and you're a contractor, for example, then I suppose generally your relationship with that business would be shorter. So there are things that would be of less interest to the business. Your kind of long-term growth and commitment to the company is probably not as applicable. So it's definitely more about the here and now and what you're able to bring from day one for the duration of what your contract is. And obviously, you sometimes extend and sometimes contractors become employed and so on. But I suppose that's the one tweak that springs to mind in terms of your approach if you're self-employed, that your business will probably have a bit less interest in your long-term growth and commitment to the business. It's more about the role and the job that you can do in the here and now.
I guess the only other point that I would add is, and I'm guessing, so forgive me if it's not right, but I would have thought that in the self-employed context, particularly if you're saying more of a freelancer or a consultant and you work for more than one company at a time, I can imagine that keeping your portfolio or your written log of what you've done, and particularly things that you're really proud of, is probably all the more important. The only thing I'd add.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to tie in maybe 2 or 3 questions that have a similar kind of question at the heart of it, which is around how much is too much. So one of our attendees mentioned that in the startup space, a 10 to 20% increase in salary is kind of like typical, but it's still a lack of clarity around what is actually a reasonable amount to ask, where it's not, not ask for too much essentially. So are there any kind of hard and fast rules or just general tips you have on how to navigate, or just to determine for yourself, I guess, like whether an amount you're asking for is reasonable?
It's definitely, it's a really tricky question, isn't it? I mean, all I can say is to reiterate, do what research you can by looking at the financial health of the business that you're working with or for, and the wider circumstances of the economy or competitors, or adverts for similar roles, and try to come up with a range of figures. Sometimes you can just trust your gut a bit cheeky here. But remember that, as I say, people do tend to undervalue themselves. So take that into account as well.
This might be going slightly off topic, so Kwaku, reel me back in if you need to. But there are other things that you can ask for. So in a sort of tech startup sector, cash might be tight, so it might be difficult for them to give you a 10-20% salary increase. But if you're committed to the business and they see you staying with the business and you can bring value, there might be other things that you can ask for. I think it's quite common for startups to give out equity, so shares in the business. So you might be able to negotiate a small shareholding instead of a salary increase, and that way you're invested in the business, because actually the profits of the business now affects the value of your shareholding. It would encourage you to stay with the business. And if the business continues to grow and does well, then you'll benefit, not immediately, but in the short to medium term, you would benefit from that as well. So try to think outside the box a little bit. And if you feel like you're reaching a dead end in terms of a cash salary, there might be other things that you can ask for.
Great, thank you, Alex. And we're going to be wrapping up very soon, but there's one scenario that an attendee has brought up, which I think is worthwhile asking. So what would your action be if you've been hired for a role that was sold as something more junior, and now that you're in the role, you're operating at a more senior level than the role you initially negotiated on? How would you renegotiate, especially if the organization is quite flat in structure? Tricky one.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Well, Steve, Alex, do jump in if you've got any thoughts to add. I mean, I would say this comes back to the question of showing the business what you are doing, all the extra value that you're bringing, and what you want to do going forward. So demonstrating your commitment to the organisation. And I think this is exactly the point. You know, you might come into that conversation with quite a different perspective. You might hurt, like you actually, it turns out to be something much different and much harder. Whereas the business might come to it from, we've hired this person, they're absolutely brilliant, and we're now loading as much work and as much responsibility onto them as possible, and that's a good thing. So I think if, as Alex has alluded to earlier, if you go into that conversation and you feel like you've been wronged and there's an injustice here, that argument might not go over so well with the business. Whereas if you can go in and say, I started from the platform you wanted me to, I'm a high performing individual, I'm doing all these different roles and adding all this value, I'd like to progress. Let's have a conversation about that. And yes, that might result in, you know, a redefinition of the role, but that is how you open the conversation out into talking about, am I being fairly paid for the work I'm doing?
Yeah, I agree with that. And whilst in the short term, if you go into a job and you think you're going to be doing a certain role and your salary reflects that, and then all of a sudden you find yourself under a lot more pressure, there's more responsibility, you're having to work harder, you're having to do things that you didn't expect to do. That's obviously not ideal in the short term, but it can also be an opportunity, because effectively if you are doing a more senior role, it makes that conversation a lot easier, because there are fewer variables, because you've already demonstrated that you can do that job. So you can almost go in to a conversation with your manager under the guise of saying, look, the role that I'm doing at the moment is not the same as the job description that I was brought in for. Can we have a conversation about redefining my role and what my responsibilities are? And in that kind of situation, you might almost be able to bring salary in through the back door and say, okay, well, you brought me in to do X, Y, and Z. I am doing that. I'm also doing this, and this. So as part of renegotiating your job description and your role, you can quite legitimately say, well, okay, well, there are all these extra responsibilities that I've taken on. I think we should probably discuss salary as well to reflect that. And that might make it a little bit less awkward for you to have that conversation.
Yeah, thank you. That makes perfect sense. And before we wrap up, it is 1 o'clock, but one final question came in that just snuck in quickly, that hopefully you can get a perspective from you guys on, which is around, a lot of times it can either be in the on application form or during the interview, you may be asked what was your previous salary, and is never 100% clear how honest you need to be when it comes to those types of questions and what you want to disclose. So how do you respond to that type of question in a polite way?
That is a really tricky question, and I think the answer again is to not say any more than you're comfortable with. I've never experienced that, because I've been at Travers all my career, but also in law, it's sort of fairly well publicised roughly what people earn, so it's never much of a surprise. I think don't give more than you're prepared to give, and if you do say a number, make sure that you're saying it for a reason and that it's relevant to the conversation. An employer might ask you to say a number, and then they can say, oh, well, we'll give you a little bit more, but that little bit more might not necessarily reflect the new role that you're doing. So I'd probably have a little think about how you might respond to that question before you go into an interview situation or a negotiation, and just try and work out what you'd be comfortable with. But if you're not comfortable, I think I don't think it is absolutely okay to say I'm not comfortable answering that question.
I think you have to ask yourself, why are they asking that question? I mean, what they're hiring you for a different role, a new role, and they should know what they're prepared to pay for it. And I don't know why what you were previously earning is relevant, particularly to that conversation. However, having said that, I think if you said that in an interview or in a response to a questionnaire, that might come across as a bit bullshit and confrontational. So maybe one way of cutting it would be to say, okay, well, I was on this, and make sure you've loaded in your bonus and other things. Don't forget about those. But actually, one of my key reasons for moving was because I was unhappy with the compensation at my previous place.
Great, thank you all. So many useful insights from everyone that's taken part, and yeah, a lot of, you could tell that very much so was a very hot topic for a lot of our attendees, because a lot of very personalized questions were added in, and thankfully you're giving some really good insights that we can use. As an organization, we're going to do a write-up on this and try to get as many insights and pull all of the information that we've gathered through these conversations and put together a piece that can help our community to kind of know how to navigate these situations further moving down the line. Thank you again individually, Andy, Alex and Siv, for taking part in this panel talk. This is just the first in the beginning of a hopefully long partnership with Travers Smith, and more events that we can do to support our community and to get into these positions within the tech sector. And yeah, so very thankful for you guys joining us here. Attendees, thank you all for joining. Hopefully you got a lot of value from the conversation. Any questions that you had in regards to it, you can still tweet us using the #TalentDoor, and we can get back to you with some responses. But until we meet again, enjoy the rest of your days, and yeah, take care. Thank you all for joining. Bye.